Good morning, everybody. Great to see everyone here this morning. It's great to be here this morning. We are continuing in our study the book of 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, and we have made it in the story to chapter 18. Samuel, as we know, as we've been looking at these higher level themes of this entire book, 1 and 2 Samuel being one book in the Hebrew, and the book of Samuel is telling us the story and showing how God is setting the pillars of the earth and how God is bringing about the king in Israel, the king that has been prophesied since Genesis, and really since Genesis chapter 3, back in the garden. And we're seeing God setting the pieces in place, and ultimately the king in Israel being a picture of the king that would come, which is Jesus in the New Testament. Before we get too much into our review from last week and our material this morning, I've asked Brother Chip to lead us in a word of prayer.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for an opportunity to be together and to look into your word and to consider what it is that you've left for us to learn from about your character, about your people, and how that we can apply those things in our lives to better please you and glorify you, to build each other up in this community, as well as to attract others to you outside of this family of your people. Be with Jacob as he stimulates our conversation this morning, that he might remember the things that he's studied and recalled and present them in a way that is meaningful to us, and help us to be good students of your word at all times. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen. Thank you, Mr. Chip. Last week, I thought Michael did a really great job covering chapter 16 and 17, and I took some notes last week. Just my general observation of those chapters last week, so I thought it might be good to kind of use that as a review for this morning, to get our heads thinking and along the track of where we are here in the story. Chapter 16 and 17, biggest themes that I was taking from that was we are continuing to learn to see life and our lives as God sees. And that's a theme that has been all through Samuel, even from the very beginning with Hannah, this eternal perspective. We saw last week Saul has lost his kingship. God has removed the kingship from King Saul because of sin. And God has sent Samuel to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse. It's very significant. And God obviously has chosen David. David, perhaps the most unlikely son of Jesse, to take the reins of leading Israel. But yet, that powerful message that God sees our hearts, and we need to learn to see things as God sees things. And God sees things when no one else does. God then removing his spirit from Saul, but then sending a distressing spirit. And I thought it was a very interesting observation that Barry had made about Satan's angels, and God using Satan's angels perhaps to send a distressing spirit. And I thought that was significant because of this word, this term, this name of God, Lord of Hosts. And we see that for the first time in the Bible in Samuel. And we've seen it a few times. We see it again last week, this Lord of Hosts, Lord of Heaven's armies. And it just seems very significant to the theme of what's happening with Israel. Obviously, the story of David and Goliath we covered last week. Again, God does not care about the outward appearance. God does not care about the numbers. God is God, and He is going to deliver David, and as He did, and David knew that, hearkening back to the courage of Jonathan, when Jonathan took on the Philistines basically single-handedly with his armor bearer. And again, all the way back to Hannah. And what seemed to be a barren woman who was not able to have a child, God, things are always possible. Things are impossible with man, and we'll get to that later on too. And so that's where we are. And then I jotted down even the songs that Adam sang yesterday or last Sunday morning. Dare to stand like Joshua, be strong and courageous, the battle belongs to the Lord. This war language is very much where we are at this point in the story of Samuel. And so to begin, chapter 18, David has defeated Goliath. And now, at the end of chapter 17, Saul is asking, who is this boy? Who is this youth? Saul had forgotten that David was the son of Jesse, or so it would seem. But that's something that he will not forget, as we'll see later on here in a few chapters. And so to begin chapter 18, verses 1 through 5, what do we see here in this interaction between Jonathan and David and their relationship? What is these first 5 verses, what does this tell us about Jonathan, where his heart is, and what does this tell us about his relation to David?
It just tells you how much they love each other. How much
Jonathan loves David. Why does Jonathan love David? Josh?
Jonathan wants to surround himself with people that think like him. They want to worship and serve God. And Jonathan has noticed that David wants to serve God, so he wants to attach himself.
That's a great point, Josh. Jonathan knows that God is with David. He recognizes that fact. He acknowledges that God has chosen David. But yet, like we talked about last week, who is the likely heir to the throne? It was Jonathan, so you would think. So, in a worldly perspective, Jonathan would have every reason to be jealous of David, maybe nervous about what that would mean for Jonathan's future hypothetical reign in Israel. But yet we see Jonathan aligning himself with David, and maybe a lesson for us to secure interest in people whom we know God is aligned with. Verse 4, Jonathan strips himself of the robe that was on him and gives it to David, as well as his armor, even his sword and his bow and his belt. There's a lot of symbolism in this book, and certainly a theme and symbolism in clothing. And here, Jonathan stripping himself of his heir to the throne, so his royal robes, giving his weapons, his power, his strength to David. What does that symbolize to you?
I think he's understanding that God has given the kingdom to David, and he's saying, I submit to God and his will, and here, you have it. I'm not the heir anymore, you are.
That's right. And what a disposition, what humility to be able to give himself over his whatever position that he may have had. He gives it to David, reminding me of John the Baptist. He must increase, but I must decrease. And this kind of servant leadership, and just an incredible disposition that we would all do well to consider. And so here we have David. In verse 6, when David returns from striking down Goliath, all the women of Israel, of all the cities of Israel, come out singing and dancing, and they sing their famous song. In verse 7, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. In verses 8 through 10, what's Saul's response to this newfound fame and recognition that David is garnering in Israel? What does Saul think about that?
jealous and angry.
He's very angry. He is very angry. And his statement in verse 8 is maybe pretty telling of what's really bothering Saul. Saul said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? God has already, through Samuel, told Saul that he has removed his kingship from Saul and that he has gone after another, a neighbor who is better than he. But yet Saul says, what more can David have but the kingdom? What does that mean, you think?
It shows he's already stolen the hearts of the people. He's the popular vote now. I mean, David.
Yeah, David is certainly the popular vote.
I think Saul's realizing that this is the guy that Samuel told me was going to take my place.
Yeah. It shows Saul's unwillingness to relinquish his power. Saul is not taking off his clothing to give to David. Saul is trying to hang on to this power, and this power that he has come to in the ranks of Israel has changed Saul greatly through this story in just a few chapters. Mr. Wayne?
You know, after the victory over the giant, David didn't expect to be exalted. He was still very humble.
That's right.
Because he says, my father is Bethlehem, your servant. And he isn't expecting exaltation. And I think about the common people when they wanted to make Jesus king, that you see how jealousy erupted, and it's just common in those that don't have any humility and actually saw. And Jonathan was humble, but I think he's recognizing so much.
Absolutely. The jealousy of Saul is really what we're talking about this morning, these next few chapters, and what that jealousy has done to Saul. Verse 10, again, a harmful spirit from God rushes upon Saul. And here we have David playing the lyre. You remember David, with the Spirit of God, could comfort Saul. He was the only one that could. And here we have David sitting playing a musical instrument. But Saul is sitting, and what does Saul have in his hand? A spear. When was the last time we saw a spear in the story? It was Goliath. And perhaps a lot of symbolism between that and Goliath, and how Saul, instead of looking to conquer the Philistines and conquer Goliath and the enemies of God, Saul is absolutely in every way becoming an enemy of God.
It's showing his increasing insecurity that nobody likes him.
Yep.
And that he's like constantly paranoid somebody's going to attack him. He's going to have that spear in his hand pretty much the rest of his life, where he's just waiting for somebody to attack him. I mean, even another time later, a few times he's going to have
Yeah. Saul is going nuts. I mean, this is not normal. This would be the equivalent of, Joe Biden sitting in the Oval Office with a loaded shotgun in his hand. It's like, that'd be real weird. He has lost his mind, and he's also distorting who his enemy is. And that's a theme that we'll see throughout these next couple chapters too. Franco?
It's also interesting looking back when they requested for a king, when you see the jealousy that this king has compared to the jealousy that God has for us. It's such a big contrast, because the jealousy that God has for us is to draw us close to Him, to become holy. But this jealousy here is more of selfishness.
Absolutely.
Drawing them further away.
Yeah, the selfishness of Saul, and the jealousy, which is a result of the selfishness, is really what is his undoing in these chapters.
To reconcile us and create that relationship, but here it's more, I want to part ways with you. You're an enemy.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so, what does Saul do? David's playing the lyre. Saul hurls his spear, thinking, I will pin David to the wall. It says, but David evaded him twice. I'm not sure that means at this instance that he threw the spear twice, if he threw it once, but he had to get away, or he had two spears. I'm not sure, but at any rate, things have really changed in Israel and with Saul. This is not the same Saul that Samuel anointed, that had battled Nahash the serpent and the Ammonites and was uniting Israel. This, just a few short chapters later, this is a very different Saul that we're talking about here. And Saul, verse 12, was afraid of David because the Lord was with him. And how sad. Of all things to anger someone and cause someone to be jealous of another, he's angry and afraid because God was with him. But he had departed from Saul.
That should concern you more than anything, realistically. More than David's power or anything is God, because then God's against him.
That's right. And so, verse 13 to 16, what do we see here in verses 13 through 16? That's right, Michael. David having success in all of his undertakings, God is with him. Interesting, verse 16, Israel and Judah loved David. Israel and Judah hadn't split yet, but yet that's here. Thought that was interesting, but at any rate, the people are united and have rallied around David, and Saul is absolutely couldn't be any more angry about that. Continuing on, verse 17 to about, really to about 25. What do we see here? David and Michal. So if you remember, part of the arrangement for whoever would take down Goliath back in chapter 16 was that they would have the right to marry one of the king's daughters. So here we have David and then Saul. And Saul tries to give David his eldest daughter, Merab. But how sinister in what he says. And we start really seeing this just evil come out in Saul when he tells David, I will give her to you for a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. But he was thinking when he said that, let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him. How evil and sinister that even in saying, yeah, David, go out and fight the Lord's battles. And he's just thinking all along, I hope he gets killed by the Philistines.
It's so reminiscent of what David did to Uriah.
That's right.
The exact same thing. I'll put him in a dangerous position and he'll die.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really really sad, but he's hoping that this will be his undoing. In verse 18, David said to Saul, who am I? And who are my relatives, my father's clan in Israel, that I should be son-in-law to the king? Who was David's father's clan, his relatives in Israel? Judah. David is of the tribe of Judah. Okay. And Saul was a Benjaminite. So we see here Judah, who from Genesis 49, Jacob blessing his 12 sons, the scepter would never depart from the tribe of Judah. Michael?
The interesting thing to me about this chapter is the people that you would think would be Saul's closest allies against David are actually like two of David's strongest allies. Like
Yeah.
two of his children.
Yeah.
Jonathan, his heir, is actually like David's best friend and acknowledges that David's going to be the next king.
Yeah.
And then one of his daughters is his wife, and she loves him greatly.
Yeah.
So you just see what happens when the Spirit of God is upon you, like you're just blessed continually, and David's bar graph or whatever, the line graph, just keep going up. Saul keeps going down.
Yeah. Saul's becoming more and more blind, like Eli had become. And his perception of reality is greatly distorted into what's actually the truth. Saul's oldest daughter was already given for a wife. And so Saul finds out that Michal, his other daughter, loved David. And really interesting what Saul says in verse 21. This pleased Saul, and that Saul thought, let me give her, that is Michal, to David, that she may be a snare for him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. What do you think Saul meant by that? Is that telling of what he thought about Michal, or? That's an interesting statement.
I think it's referring to the endowment that he would have to pay, and he's going to make it pay for the 140.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe so.
I think that was the trap, not Michal herself, I think.
It's kind of interesting. I don't know if this is a premonition, but women would end up being the downfall of David. A woman was the downfall of Simpson, which we've talked about in every class, I feel like, this whole quarter. But Saul says, let her be a snare. And do you remember in our Proverbs class, chapters 1 to 9, how often that came up? Lady folly. And the whole time, chapters 1 to 9 talked about laying a snare. And women, lady folly, being a snare, trying to lie in wait and catch the young man and keep him off of the right path. That's the picture. And here we have snares, an interesting word to use. But nevertheless, continuing on, Saul tells his servants, speak to David in private. Behold, the king has delight in you. In verse 23, Saul's servant spoke those words in the ears of David, and David said, does it seem to you a little thing to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and have no reputation? Again, this humility of David, recognizing who he is. He thought very lowly of himself, and Saul at one time had that said about him. Even in recent chapters, Samuel told Saul, you're small in your eyes, but you are the king of Israel. And David here saying, I'm a poor man and have no reputation. Reminding back again to Hannah's prayer in chapter 2, God lifts the poor and the needy, and this reversal that we see, and again, this eternal perspective, not seeing things, giving weight and value to how the world sees this life and money and possessions, but rather seeing things as God does. If you remember later in Matthew chapter 19 with Jesus, when he told his disciples that it'd be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven, and his disciples were greatly astonished. And they said, "Oh Lord, who could be saved?" So it's still something that we need to consider. And so, verse 25, Saul gives his dowry, as Alan had mentioned, to David. The king desires no bride price except for 100 foreskins of the Philistines, that he may be avenged of the king's enemies. I thought it was kind of funny how he mentioned that. I'm not going to ask a bride price, but just 100 foreskins of the Philistines. And what's Saul's logic in asking that? He was hoping the Philistines would kill him. Surely if you go out there to circumcise 100 Philistines, it's probably not going to turn out too well for you. And that's exactly what he's looking to do. Thought it was interesting in this story of the conquering of Canaan. When was the last time that we saw a mass circumcision? Remember Joshua chapter 5 when the Israelites were entering into Canaan at Gilgal, when the Lord told Joshua to make knives out of flint and stones and to circumcise the children of Israel to roll away the reproach of Egypt. Gilgal meant roll away in Hebrew. And Gilgal, how often has Gilgal come up in the story? And that's going to come up again here, I believe, in the next chapter or so. But just an interesting tie.
He didn't circumcise them while they're alive. He killed them and then circumcised.
That's right. Yeah, David had. Yeah, this was a little bit of a different picture, but it is a picture that I think we'll see, especially as we get into the story, chapter 19, of the reason that the reproach of Egypt was to be rolled away. Was because God's people were holy. They were to be set apart from the uncircumcised Philistines and the uncircumcised nations around them. Remember, that was one of David's main complaints about Goliath. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Michelle?
You know, Saul keeps talking about by the hand of the Philistines, the hand of the Philistines, and he forgot the hand of the Lord is with David.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, Saul has got everything backwards, and he's forgotten an awful lot, as it would seem. And so David goes out and does just exactly what he has been asked. In verse 28, when Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, his daughter, loved him, Saul was even more afraid of David. So Saul was David's enemy continually. Again, who once was the king and fighting the Lord's battles is now absolutely become the enemy. And it's the good things that David is doing that is causing Saul to be so jealous and so angry. And what a sad picture. In verse 30, the commanders of the Philistines came out to battle, and as often as they came out, David had more success than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. Any final thoughts about chapter 18? Yes, sir.
Just always needed, even the background that Saul has never repented from what he did in chapter 13, what he did in chapter 15. He's been called on the carpet by Samuel a couple of times, and it's always amazing to watch in these situations. You can see this all the way through Samuel and Kings, etc. The things that go bad for people are not so much what they did, but their unrepentant attitude. And that's Saul. And here, it always blows my mind. Eli's the same way. God goes whack on Eli, and he never humbles himself. He never repents. He never says, "I've been a real bozo here," and does something about it. He just continues on the same path, and it ends up disaster for him and his descendants. And we see Saul doing exactly the same thing.
Yeah, it's a great point. Saul has, for several chapters here, had a pretty terrible attitude, and it's just the pillar of Saul coming down. The Lord sets the pillars of the earth, and Saul's pillar coming down and his kingship coming down is really of his own doing. And that could be the case for any of us. Chad?
Maybe going back in history a little bit, all of this is because they wanted a king like everybody else.
That's right.
And they had a king. His name was Jehovah.
Yeah.
That's where their trust, life, their character should be placed in. But they allow society to influence them, the neighbors. Well, they have a king, we want a king.
Yeah.
They didn't need a king.
Yeah.
So because of that lack of faith, I think sin that they committed, we have all of this, 1st, 2nd Samuel, and all these issues.
Yeah. Yeah, but now you've got a real problem in Saul at the helm of the kingship of Israel. Chapter 19, Saul spoke to Jonathan, his son, to all his servants, that they should kill David. So Saul tried to kill him. He tried to get the Philistines to kill him by getting David to circumcise him. None of this has worked. And now he's telling Jonathan, his son, and the servants, y'all kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David. And so really chapter 19 and 20, we're going to see this Jonathan playing the part of an intercessor for David to his father Saul, and looking out for David, but really also looking out for his father, trying to get Saul to see the truth. But we'll see if that works. Verse 4, Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul his father and said to him, "Let not the king sin against his servant David, because he has not sinned against you, and because his deeds have brought good to you." Again, why are you're not seeing clearly? Your jealousy, your resentment is not allowing you to see things with any sort of objectivity. David has brought good to you. This is not your enemy. He took his life in his hand, struck down the Philistine, and the Lord worked a great salvation for all Israel. You saw it, and you rejoiced. Why then will you sin against innocent blood by killing David without cause? Innocent blood, killing of David without cause. Does that remind you of a future king in Israel? And to the point that Barry had made, Saul has not repented. And then here, the shedding of innocent blood, going back to Deuteronomy 19, when it talked about the cities of refuge. Okay, if you were out in the woods cutting lumber and you accidentally killed somebody, you had a city of refuge that you could go to. But if you intentionally killed someone, premeditated, cold-blooded murder, you were to be killed, period. There's no jail. You were killed. Because Deuteronomy 19 said that the land was to be purged of evil. And, that's really how David kind of was looking at Goliath. When David said, the Lord has helped me fight lions and bears. This uncircumcised, blasphemous Philistine, this land has to be purged of this, and I'm going to kill him just like an animal. Because he didn't see him as any sort of godly, religious. There was nothing good. He wasn't even a human in his eyes. He had to purge and cleanse the land. And Jonathan here is saying, look, if you kill David and shed this innocent blood, what's going to happen? I mean, we have to adhere to the law, and we can't have innocent blood on the hands of the land. And Saul listened to the voice of Jonathan, and Saul swore. And that's a big two words in the story. Saul swore, "As the Lord lives, he shall not be put to death." Jonathan called David, and Jonathan reported to him all these things. Jonathan brought David to Saul, and he was in his presence as before. So Saul swears that he's not going to kill David. And Jonathan remembers that. And as we continue on, just a few verses. That's right, sorry. Verse 10, Saul sought to pin David to the wall with a spear. This is again. He just swore. But as he sat in his house, a spear in his hand, he sought to pin David to the wall with a spear. But he eluded Saul, and he struck the spear into the wall, and David fled and escaped that night. So this is at least the second time that Saul has tried to kill David with a spear. And what's so bad this time, if it wasn't bad enough before, is he just swore to God that he wasn't going to kill David. But this just shows how little Saul cares about God at this point. He's so far past caring about anything to do with God or oaths or keeping his word or being a good man or anything. He's got it out for David, and his own selfish rage has blinded him from seeing the truth. And then we see verse 11 to 17 or so, the story of Michal. So we have Jonathan trying to look out for David by trying to persuade his father Saul not to kill David. And then now we have Michal, his daughter, David's wife, who is trying to do the same thing. And the story, picking up in verse 11, Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, if you don't escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. And so Michal helps David through the window, and he fled and escaped, kind of reminding of Rahab and that story, letting the spies escape down the wall. And then Michal took an image and laid it on the bed and put a pillow of goat's hair at his head and covered it with clothes. So she made kind of this dummy, so to speak. And when Saul's messenger saw it, they said he's sick. Did you ever see the movie Escape from Alcatraz, where they had made the dummy? Just reminded me of that. Kind of said maybe they got it from this. They probably did. But also reminding of Jacob and Esau and the hair of goat on his arm. Deception, but the Lord's will was to be done. So it wasn't wrong that she did this. Michal's not lying, because God's will has to be accomplished. Verse 18, David fled and escaped. And where did he run off to? He goes to Samuel at Ramah. And I just thought that was just so telling of what David thought about Samuel. And Mr. Wayne?
Before we go on, in 13, the verse that I got says that she put the household idol in the bed.
Yep.
When Saul said she would be a snare to David, do you think this could be a part of it? How does the daughter of the king end up with an idol in she and David's house? It's not David's idol.
Yeah.
I would suppose it would be hers. So there's a problem. It doesn't really go into it, but I'm really amazed that there would be a household idol in David's house.
Yeah, I feel like there's a pretty strong tie there that Saul maybe knew something about Michal that we get a hint of here, because that does translate to some sort of idol, some sort of god that Michal had, perhaps. And so maybe, it pleased Saul when he found out that Michal loved David, and maybe it was because, maybe Michal will pull David away from God because she's, I don't know. That's an interesting point. That's something to consider. David flees, comes to Samuel at Ramah, and he and Samuel went and lived at Naioth. This word means dwelling, and perhaps this was some sort of community of prophets or community of study, almost like a house of study within Ramah, almost like a study hall type situation that maybe Samuel was over. I don't know the whole message there. Maybe it's not that important, but anyhow, this is where they are. And then Saul sends a series of messengers to capture David, to kill him. And every time his messengers come to David and Samuel, what happens?
What did he prophesy?
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know.
Basically, they're prophesying that Saul's going to die and David's going to live.
They prophesy something. And it's astonishing. It's an interesting scene. But he does this 3 times. He sends messengers to capture them and bring them back. And every time, all of the messengers are prophesying and raving. And then, verse 22, Saul decides, I'm just going to go do it myself. And I'm just going to go. He himself went to Ramah and came to the great well. Do you remember the last time that Saul was on the road to Ramah and there was a well? What that scene was back in chapter 9 or 10 of 1 Samuel? When's the last time Saul was at Ramah?
When he's looking for his donkey.
That's it. That's it. He was looking for his father's donkeys, and then Saul's helper, his associate, says, I think there's a seer in this town. Maybe we should go find this seer, and he could tell us our way back home or tell us where the donkeys are. And when they were at a well, Saul runs into a woman there and asks him, is there a seer in the city? Where is it? And then she leads him to Samuel. And here he is, back at Ramah, back at a well, and looking for Samuel again, but for a very different reason. If he finds Samuel this time, he's probably going to kill him, whereas before he was seeking counsel. So again, just this contrast of where he's come to. And the Spirit of God came upon him also. As he went, he prophesied until he came to Naioth and Ramah. And he too, that is Saul, he too stripped off his clothes. And he too prophesied before Samuel and lay naked all that day and all that night. Thus it is said, is Saul also among the prophets. So Saul, perhaps unwilling to relinquish his power, his royal clothing, his sword, his armor, but he has it stripped from him. And what a picture. And the pillar of Saul's kingship has been brought down. And that last verse is Saul also among the prophets. You remember the first time that was asked, the answer was yes, or so it would seem. And then this time, that was a long time ago. And now is Saul also among the prophets is a phrase of mocking, and just how sad and pitiful this man has lost his mind, naked on the ground. You know, this is what you've become. He is completely undone. Any other observations or thoughts about chapter 19?
It's the oddest passage in the whole Bible. Cannot make heads or tails of it, except to say that God uses this so that they can't get David. And everybody who comes, they start prophesying, and so they can't control their own desires to kill him. And it's just one of the oddest ways that God used that I've ever seen to try to protect one of his own.
The Lord of heaven's armies.
Yeah.
You know, and it's not about how many messengers you got or how strong they are. There is a power at work.
I think the point of it is kind of an undoing of the anointing. And one of the confirmations for him was, the Spirit of the Lord is going to rush upon you, you're going to prophesy. And now it's like, the Spirit of the Lord is going to come on you almost as like a weapon at this point against you, to show you that you are not among God's favorite anymore.
Yeah.
I think of Saul in the New Testament. You would think that a man like Saul in the New Testament would be a man who could not be changed. And yet, similarly, on the road to Damascus, the Lord overcomes him.
He turned him around.
Just like he does Saul in the Old Testament, in this passage.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Did you have something?
Yeah, I was just going to ask the question as well. We kind of glossed over it a little bit in chapter 18 and verse 10, the harmful spirit from God upon Saul, and then again in 19.
Yep.
Both times, that's what causes him to sort of go mad with murderous rage. And, but I really like the way you put it, Michael. I think that's what's going on there. Is the Spirit of God formerly was empowering him, and now it's causing him to be brought low.
Yeah.
Kind of the idea.
Back in chapter 16, verse 14, it says that the harmful spirit from the Lord was tormenting him.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know, but yeah, maybe another class. I think there's probably a bigger message there, but I'm not going to try to attempt that today. But it's a good thought. Chapter 20, Michael. I don't know if we're going to get through chapter 20, so I'm sorry about that. But chapter 20 is continuing on, Jonathan trying to help warn David, and really the big picture of chapter 20 is seeing that Jonathan has made an oath, a covenant with David. He has tried his best to align himself forever and his house forever with David, because he knows that God has shown his favor upon David. And David's trying to tell Jonathan how bad Saul is. He doesn't want to believe it, but then Jonathan finds out. And maybe we'll touch on this chapter next week. But thank you all for your comments.